Hello, my name is Daniela Pantusa. I'm currently a fourth-year student at McMaster in the Arts and Science program. In this video, I'll be talking about music's impact on young people's identity development. This project was completed for Art Sci for CO6 thesis under the supervision of Professor Rachael Finnerty. So to start things off, I'll go over a quick overview of what I'll be discussing in this video. I'll start with an introduction to my project. I'll go over the purpose and the methods. I'll talk a bit about the results that I found and discuss them further, and then I'll end off with any further research considerations. So to start things off, I invite all of you watching this video to think of a time when you found yourself impacted by music in some way. Maybe it was a time you found that you really identified with the lyrics of a song, or maybe you found someone who had the same favorite band as you and you felt like you understood them more deeply. Perhaps it's not a certain instance, but something that happens every time you listen to music. Or maybe you can't think of a time or music hasn't impacted you in any way, and that's okay too. Music is something that young people in particular find attractive. And there are so many aspects of music that could help to aid identity formation. There are the lyrics, the ability to perform, write, create, and listen to music, as well as the more social aspects, such as being able to go to concerts or identifying as a fan of a certain band or a genre of music. Considering all these different aspects of music, I went into this thesis just wanting to investigate the current literature on music's impact on young people's identity formation and to provide a comprehensive review of that literature. I decided to focus on papers looking at individuals aged 10 to 24 because these are particularly formative years and also years in which an individual gains increased independence as they enter into adulthood. So the first step for me was to define identity and determine the types of identity I wanted to focus on. I decided to split identity into three different parts: self-identity, personal identity, and social identity. Self-identity can be defined as a person's self-concept as a consequence of the positions they occupy or behavior that they engage in regularly. Personal identity can be defined as self-definitions in terms of unique characteristics. And finally, social identity can be defined as identification based off of group membership. And some examples of groups can be familial, ethnic, or religious. Now, personal identity and self-identity, their definitions sound pretty similar, and I do think that they're very much related. But I like to differentiate them by saying that self-identity is more focused on behaviors and actions, while personal identity is focused on how an individual sees themselves as different from other individuals. So moving on to my methods, I identified 29,839 records through database search, with an additional 50 records identified through other resources. I went through the process of title screening, removing duplicates, and screening abstracts, and then finally going through whole articles for eligibility. I ended up with 18 that I decided to include in my final literature review. So while reading the 18 articles more in depth, my goal was to determine if there were any trends in the literature, which there were. I found that the papers fit nicely into my three-pronged approach to identity. I found that 4 articles fell under the category of social identity, 6 talked about self-identity, and 5 talked about personal identity. There were 3 articles that touched both on self and personal identity, which made sense to me considering that their definitions are very much related and very similar. I also found that the articles fell into 3 categories based off types of content. And these categories I named evidence, mechanisms, and applications. So the articles in the evidence category, they aimed to look at the question, does music actually impact young people's identity development? The articles in the mechanisms category usually built off the findings from those in the evidence category and aim to describe how music contributes to young people's identity formation, and really looked at in what ways music can help facilitate identity formation in young people. Finally, were the application articles. These articles built off the findings from those in the mechanisms category and really aimed to look at how we can use music as a tool for young people's identity formation in the context of therapy and other interventions. So we can look at evidence, mechanisms, and applications a little bit more and look at the trends that I found within those three categories. So we can start with evidence. All the articles that I looked at found that music does impact young people's identity development, and it was found that all three types of identity could be impacted by music. Finally, from the 18 articles that I included in this analysis, only positive impacts on identity development were found. Moving on to the mechanisms, a few different mechanisms were brought up time and time again in the literature, and I'll go over 4 of those. The first being music as a mirror. So articles that discussed music as a mirror proposed that the mechanism here was that music would allow a person to, and I'm going to quote from one of the articles, experience something of the self in an external object. So the external object here is music, and that process of being able to see something of the internal self in an external object, that was argued to allow for the revealing of aspects of the self that might not be known to the individual. The next is music as exploration. And like I mentioned at the beginning, there are so many different aspects of music that an individual might be able to identify with. But there are also so many different aspects of identity, emotions, and so many images in music. And that aspect of music, the fact that there are so many identities within music, that was argued to be the mechanism in the case of music as exploration. So it's argued that these aspects of music allowed people to feel a range of internal states and kind of try on or explore different aspects of their identity. Next is, and very much related to music as exploration, is music as agency. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I decided to focus on articles looking at individuals aged 10 to 24 because it's a time of increased independence and increased responsibility. But I also found it interesting that especially around the younger ages of that age group, age 10 to 24, and especially in adolescence, there's often limited opportunities for an individual to act as an independent agent. So the argument here was that music allows, the argument here was that it's the ability for the young person to choose their own music that allows them to realize that they can control their own environment and gives them a sense of agency that relates to the overall sense of being somebody and thus identity. Finally, we can look at music as helping to form a narrative. So this is based off McAdams' life story model of identity. And it was argued that music, but especially writing and creating music, really allows for self-reflection that encourages an individual to form a coherent and cohesive narrative identity. Finally, we can look at the applications category. And what I found to be the case was that the application articles tended to focus on group therapy. And it was found that music performance and songwriting was particularly helpful in a group therapy setting to facilitate identity formation. And finally, I found that music was particularly beneficial for individuals dealing with mental health concerns and the recently immigrated. So I'll use individuals dealing with mental health concerns as an example to illustrate this point. Many of the articles that looked at music for individuals struggling with their mental health, they found that individuals dealing with mental health issues often take on what they called an illness identity. And their illness often becomes the forefront or what they consider to be the focal point of their identity. It's what they perceive themselves as, and what others begin to perceive them as. Music was found to be a really healthy way to allow them to not only explore other aspects of their identity, but also express different aspects of their identity. So they weren't just seen as being ill or being sick. So where can we go from here? I truly believe that there are so many different avenues left to explore when it comes to music's impact on young people's identity development, but I'll touch on two in this video. The first is that I think we should address the lack of research into the possible applications of music's use in social identity formation. So like I mentioned on the last slide, a lot of the application articles focused on group therapy, but it was always in the context of building or strengthening self-identity and personal identity, but never social identity. So I think that there's some room for some more research on group music therapy being able to impact social identity formation. And second, I think that we should consider musical genre in further research. So all of the papers that I looked at discussed music very generally and in a broad sense, but I think it's worth asking the question, are some types of music better at facilitating positive identity formation than others? Thank you for listening to my thesis project on music's impact on young people's identity development. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at daniela.pantusa5@gmail.com. Thank you.